The schoolyard echoed with laughter as a group of kids pointed at the girl's shoes. They were worn out, the fabric frayed, and the soles barely holding together. "Look at those," one boy jeered. "She probably found them in the trash," another sneered. The girl's face turned red, her eyes fixed on the ground. She didn't respond, but the sting of humiliation burned deep. From the edge of the courtyard, a man in a tailored suit paused mid-step. He had just arrived for a guest lecture about leadership and success, none other than billionaire entrepreneur Richard Hale. His sharp eyes caught the cruelty unfolding before him. Then something unexpected happened. Without a word, Richard walked straight toward the girl. The crowd of mocking children fell silent as the billionaire knelt down on one knee. Carefully, he reached for her laces, tying them with surprising gentleness. The whispers spread like wildfire. Why is a billionaire on his knees for her? The girl finally looked up, startled, meeting his gaze. And in that moment, Richard realized, she wasn't who everyone thought she was. The courtyard had gone completely still. Even the kids who had mocked her stood frozen, watching in disbelief. Richard tied the last knot, then looked up at her with a warm smile. "There," he said softly. "Shoes don't make you who you are. But tell me, why didn't you say anything back?" The girl hesitated. Her voice was quiet, almost trembling. "Because, it doesn't matter what they think. I know who I am." Those words struck Richard harder than he expected. Most adults he knew in boardrooms and high-rise offices couldn't summon that kind of strength. This little girl, in her battered shoes, carried herself with a dignity that silenced even cruelty. One of the boys muttered under his breath, "Why is he even helping her?" "She's nobody." Richard turned his head sharply, his expression shifting from kind to commanding. "Nobody." His voice boomed, echoing off the school walls. "Let me tell you something. You're all wrong. This young lady is worth more than all the shoes in this city." The crowd gasped. The girl blinked in surprise. How could a billionaire speak about her like that? But Richard wasn't finished. "Do you even know who she is?" he asked the children, his eyes narrowing. The kids exchanged confused glances, shaking their heads. Richard smiled faintly, almost knowingly. "Then maybe it's time you found out." The air seemed heavier now, every child waiting for Richard's next words. The girl's heartbeat raced. What could he possibly mean? Richard stood, straightening his expensive jacket, but he kept one hand gently on the girl's shoulder. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "greatness hides in places no one expects. You see old shoes," he pointed at her feet, "but what I see is someone who will change more lives than any of you can imagine." The children stared at him, wide-eyed. A billionaire's words carried weight, and suddenly their laughter didn't feel so funny anymore. The girl's lips parted, ready to protest. "I'm not," she began, but Richard raised a hand kindly. "You don't need to explain. You will understand soon enough." A teacher finally rushed over, breathless from hearing the commotion. She froze when she saw Richard Hale standing there. Mr. Hale," she stammered. Is everything all right?" Richard glanced at the teacher, then back at the children. "Not quite," he said. "I came here to inspire students today, but it looks like this young lady is about to inspire me instead." The teacher's eyes softened. She knew something the kids didn't. But before she could speak, Richard leaned closer to the girl and whispered words that made her eyes widen in shock. "Your father didn't tell me you were here today." The girl froze, staring at him as if he had just revealed a secret she thought no one knew. "My father?" she whispered. Richard gave a small nod, his tone gentle but steady. "Yes. He and I spoke just last week." The courtyard buzzed with whispers again. The kids leaned in, their curiosity now stronger than their cruelty. Who was her father? Why did a billionaire know him? The girl's hands trembled as she clutched her backpack straps. She had never told her classmates about her family, never mentioned her father's identity. All they ever saw were her worn-out shoes and quiet nature. Richard looked out at the sea of puzzled faces. "You see," he said firmly, "the way you treated her today shows how little you understand about people. Wealth and worth don't show up in shiny sneakers or polished clothes. True value comes from character, resilience, and, yes, sometimes from a legacy you cannot even begin to measure." The teacher covered her mouth, realizing what Richard was about to reveal. The girl shook her head quickly, whispering, "Please, don't." Richard knelt again, this time not to tie her shoes, but to look her directly in the eyes. His voice dropped low, for her ears only. "They need to know who you are, whether you like it or not. Hiding won't protect you forever." Her chest tightened. She wanted to melt into the ground, but she also knew, he was right. Richard slowly stood and faced the crowd. "This girl," he declared, "isn't just any student. She is the daughter of one of the most powerful people in this city." Gasps erupted. The children's eyes grew wide, the teacher's knees nearly buckled, and the girl's world tilted on its axis. The courtyard erupted into shocked murmurs. The kids who had mocked her shoes now stared in disbelief, some with their mouths hanging open. Richard raised a hand, and silence quickly returned. His voice was steady, commanding the moment. "Her father is a man I've worked with personally, a visionary, a leader, someone whose name you all know. And yet his daughter stands here, being ridiculed for something as trivial as her shoes." The girl's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to stop him, but her voice felt trapped in her chest. The teacher finally found her words. "Mr. Hale, are you saying she's—" Her voice trailed off, afraid to finish the sentence. Richard nodded. "Yes. She is the daughter of Alexander Grant." The courtyard fell silent again. Everyone knew the name. Alexander Grant, the tech mogul who had built an empire, one of the most influential figures in the entire nation. The girl's classmates looked at her in utter shock. The same girl they had mocked just minutes ago was heir to a fortune beyond their imagination. But Richard wasn't finished. He looked directly at the children who had laughed at her. "And here's the lesson you all need to learn today: you never know who someone truly is. You never know the battles they fight, or the destiny they carry." Mocking her shoes was not just cruel, it was foolish. Because in years to come, she may be the one deciding the future you live in. The words hit like a thunderclap. The girl felt every eye on her, but for the first time, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. The silence in the courtyard grew heavier, almost reverent. The kids who had been laughing now shuffled uncomfortably, some lowering their heads in shame. The girl, however, felt her heart racing. She never wanted her identity revealed like this. She had worked so hard to just be herself, not Alexander Grant's daughter, not a shadow of a powerful name. She whispered urgently, tugging on Richard's sleeve. "Why did you tell them?" Richard bent slightly, his expression soft. "Because sometimes the truth is the only shield against cruelty. They needed to understand who they were hurting. And you needed to remember your own worth." Her eyes watered. She wasn't sure if she was angry at him or grateful, but deep down, a spark of pride lit inside her. The teacher finally stepped forward, her tone gentle but firm. "Class, I hope you've all learned something important today. We don't measure people by their shoes, their clothes, or what they look like. Respect should never depend on wealth or status." Richard nodded. "Exactly. But let me add this: wealth and power may impress people for a moment, but character is what defines you forever." He looked down at the girl with a faint smile. "And I believe she has more of it than most adults I've met." The children stood frozen, unable to argue. A few even muttered quiet apologies. The girl took a shaky breath, standing a little taller than before. For once, she didn't feel invisible. The girl's classmates lingered in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between her and Richard. A few of the children who had mocked her the loudest now looked as though they wanted to disappear. Richard's gaze swept across the crowd. Do you see what happened today? All of you judged her by the surface. Shoes. Clothes. Appearances. That's the shallowest way to see a person. True greatness is invisible until it shows itself. The teacher folded her arms, nodding firmly. And I expect each of you to remember that. Slowly, one of the boys, the one who had laughed first, stepped forward. His face was pale, his voice unsteady. I'm sorry, he mumbled. I didn't know. The girl looked at him, her hands still gripping her backpack straps. For a moment she considered ignoring him, but then she shook her head. It doesn't matter who my dad is, she said quietly but clearly. Even if I wasn't his daughter, you still shouldn't treat people like that. Her words landed heavier than Richard's speech. The boy looked down at the ground, shame burning in his cheeks. Richard smiled faintly. Well said. That's the lesson everyone needs to take from this moment. The teacher exhaled with relief, as if a storm had finally passed. The girl felt a strange strength rising inside her, one she hadn't felt before. She realized she didn't need to hide anymore. And yet, as the courtyard slowly returned to whispers and murmurs, she couldn't shake the thought that her life would never be the same after today. The bell rang, but no one moved. The courtyard was still charged with the weight of what had just happened. The girl stood rooted to the spot, her face flushed, her chest rising and falling quickly. Richard leaned closer to her. You handled that better than most adults would, he said quietly. You spoke truth, not anger. That's strength. She looked up at him, unsure whether to smile or cry. But now everyone knows, they'll treat me differently. Richard's expression softened. Yes, they might. But remember this, your worth isn't borrowed from your father's name. It comes from who you are. And what you showed them today was courage. The teacher placed a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. He's right. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for everyone who's ever been mocked or overlooked. For the first time, the girl allowed herself a small smile. Meanwhile, the classmates who had once ridiculed her shuffled away, some whispering apologies, others too embarrassed to say anything at all. Word of what had just happened was already spreading. By the end of the day, the entire school would know. Richard straightened his jacket, preparing to leave for his scheduled lecture. But before he stepped away, he looked down at her one last time. You'll remember this day, he said firmly. Not because they mocked you, but because you discovered something important. Sometimes the very thing people laugh at is what makes you unshakable. The girl nodded slowly. She would never forget his words. And though she still wore the same battered shoes, somehow, they no longer felt so heavy. As Richard walked toward the auditorium for his lecture, the girl lingered in the courtyard, her thoughts spinning. She could still feel the sting of the laughter, but now it was mixed with something else, pride, and a strange kind of power. A small group of classmates approached her hesitantly. One of the girls, who had stood back during the mocking, spoke first. Hey. I'm sorry they made fun of you. I should have said something. The girl blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected anyone to apologize. It's okay, she said softly. Then she added, but next time, say something. Not just for me, for anyone. The girl's words seemed to strike a chord. The group nodded, and slowly drifted away, leaving her with a quiet sense of dignity she hadn't felt before. Inside the auditorium, Richard's voice carried across the speakers as he began his talk. The students filing in could hear him say, success is not built on money, or image, or even talent alone. It's built on resilience, the kind I saw this morning in a young student who taught us all a lesson. The girl's heart skipped. He was talking about her. She sat quietly in the back of the hall as Richard continued. One day, some of you will be leaders, inventors, builders of the future. But if you forget compassion, if you judge people by what they wear, or what they own, you will fail before you begin. Every word echoed in her chest. For the first time, she felt like maybe her worn-out shoes had given her something no polished pair could, a story that no one would forget. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled, but the silence inside was powerful. Every student hung on Richard's words. He paused for a moment, scanning the audience before continuing. When I walked into this school today, I came to share lessons about business and leadership. But instead, I was the one reminded of something far more important: humility. The girl shifted in her seat, her fingers brushing against the frayed laces of her shoes. She no longer felt embarrassed by them. Somehow, they now seemed like proof of what she had endured, and overcome. Richard's voice grew stronger. You see, true leaders don't look down on others. They don't mock. They lift people up. Because the person you look down on today, may be the one standing above you tomorrow. The audience stirred with whispers of agreement. Even the students who had mocked her earlier now avoided each other's eyes, guilt written all over their faces. Richard then looked toward the back of the room, where the girls sat. Their eyes met for just a second, and she felt her heart leap. He gave her the faintest nod, as if to say, "This is your moment, too." For the first time all day, she smiled without hesitation. The lecture ended in thunderous applause. But while the crowd clapped for Richard Hale, the girl knew the message was really about her, and about anyone who had ever been underestimated. And deep down, she felt it, her story was only just beginning. When the applause finally faded, students began filing out of the auditorium, buzzing with chatter about what they had just heard. The girl stayed seated, clutching her backpack tightly, unsure whether to leave or wait. Richard descended from the stage, his assistants trailing behind him with tablets and schedules in hand. But instead of heading for the exit, he walked straight toward the back of the hall, toward her. The students still lingering in the rows stopped to watch. Richard crouched slightly so he was eye level with her. "I meant every word," he said gently. "You reminded me today that titles and money don't make someone great. Courage does. And you have that." Her throat tightened, and she whispered, "But what if I don't want people to know who my dad is? What if I just want to be, me?" Richard's eyes softened. "Then that's exactly who you'll be. And the world will see you for your strength, not your name. But never be ashamed of where you come from, it's part of your story, not the whole of it." A few students standing nearby exchanged looks, whispering in awe. To them, it was surreal, a billionaire giving time and attention to one girl in worn shoes. The girl's lips trembled, but then she nodded. "Thank you, for helping me." Richard smiled, placing a hand over his chest. "No. Thank you, for reminding me what truly matters." And with that, he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the exit. But everyone in that room knew, something far more powerful than a lecture had just taken place. The next day, the school buzzed with whispers. Everyone was still talking about the moment in the courtyard, the lecture, and the shocking revelation of who the girl truly was. But as she walked through the halls, something was different. The same kids who once pointed and laughed now stepped aside, their faces filled with a mix of respect and shame. Some even managed a quiet "sorry" as she passed. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel mocked. She felt seen. When she sat at her desk, she glanced down at her shoes. They were still old, still frayed, but she smiled. Those shoes had carried her through humiliation, through whispers, and finally into strength. At lunch, one of the younger students approached timidly. "Can I sit with you?" she asked. The girl nodded, surprised at how easily the walls around her were starting to break. Across town, Richard Hale sat in his office high above the city. His assistant asked about the lecture, but Richard only smiled faintly. "I went there to teach them," he said, staring out the window, "but she's the one who taught me." From that day forward, the girl's story spread far beyond the schoolyard. Not as the billionaire's friend or the daughter of Alexander Grant, but as the girl who stood tall in worn-out shoes and showed everyone the true meaning of dignity. And as she laced those same shoes the next morning, she whispered to herself, "I know who I am." Her journey was only beginning, but now, it was on her own terms.